Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in the Wimmera Productive Soil series, supported by the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority through funding from the Australian Government's National Land Care Program. My name is Prue Cook. I'm the Director of Nine Creeks Consulting, and I've been your webinar host across the series. This webinar series has explored farm practices and innovations that Wimmera farmers can use to manage their soils and improve profitability. The webinars have examined existing and emerging approaches, focusing on local relevance and delivering current research, essential considerations and guidance on implementation. Let's get straight into today's topic by introducing today's presenters, Ross Ballard and David Peck from SARDI. Ross is a senior scientist with SARDI in Adelaide. He specialises in the ecology of rhizobia for pulses and pasture legumes and has contributed to the selection of several inoculant strains and pasture cultivars. Recent work has focused on improving legume pastures for low rainfall mixed farms through the Dryland Legume Pasturing Systems program, which we're going to be hearing a bit about today. And David Peck hails from Queensland originally, but has adopted SA as his home since '97. He is the annual legume breeder at SARDI and has bred and released a number of medic cultivars, with more in the pipeline. Before I hand you over to Ross and David, we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you can type your questions in at any time using the chat function that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll also be sent a recording of this webinar after it finishes, so don't worry if you need to leave early or if you have any technical problems. Over to you, Ross.
Okay, thanks, Prue, and good morning to everyone. So today, myself and David, we will just cover some of the work that we've completed in the Dryland Legume Pasture Systems project. And that project had a strong focus on the use of pastures in low rainfall mixed farms. Just quickly to acknowledge our funders. So this was funded by the Rural R&D for Profit, pardon me, with inputs from GRDC, MLA, AWI, and we had a number of research partners, including CSIRO and a range of grower groups, including BCG over your neck of the woods. So just a little roadmap of the presentation. After I've completed this intro, David will talk about some of the annual legume pasture options that may be relevant to you. I'll then come back in and talk a little bit about the rhizobia considerations and some of the system benefits that might encourage you to use pastures in your rotations. So the pastures we'll talk about today will broadly fall into two groups. So we've got the traditional pastures such as the annual medics, and there's a range of different species, the barrels, burrs, strands and discs. And these medics are, I guess what pulls them together is their suitability for low rainfall alkaline soils, but also that their seed has to be vacuum harvested generally. And the other group are the alternative pasture legumes. These have largely been developed in Western Australia, so have different soil type adaptation, but they differ from the medics in that most of these can be harvested with a cereal harvester. And so a focus of the project has been to show whether any of these are adapted to our environments, and if they are, that provides the opportunity to harvest seed on farm and re-establish those pastures more cheaply. The project, the Dryland Pasture Legume Systems project, had some 30 sites stretching from Western Eyre Peninsula through to north central Victoria. And there were 4 large systems trials, and I'll talk a little bit about that, which are in the surf.
We lost your audio for about 10 seconds there, sorry.
Okay, just at the beginning of this slide. I'll just return. So the Dryland Legume Pasture Systems project had 30 trial sites spread from Western Eyre Peninsula across to central Victoria, and that included 4 large multi-year systems trials, and I'll talk a little bit about the trial at Lameroo today. So I'll now hand you over to David Peck, that will talk about some of the different annual pasture legumes that we've looked at and how they might be adapted to different environments.
Yes, good morning everyone. So here's a photo of some of our pasture genera and our pasture species. As the talk goes along, we'll touch on quite a few. I hope you're familiar with the medic cargos, the medics, the clovers, but we've also got things such as the Cerodellas and the Bicerulas. So lay legume pastures reduce risk and they boost profit and the resilience. They provide high quality feed to the livestock, they benefit the following crops, and they reduce economic risk. So the photo we have here is sheep grazing annual meadows that have regenerated through last year's wheat stubbles from the soil seed reserves that they have. So for lay pasture systems, you need cultivars with high levels of hard seed that allow them to regenerate after 1 to 3 years of crops. So just a little timeline of pasture development. So if you look at the top row there, the ones in green are the annual meadows. You can see the first barrel medic developed way back in the 30s, and then slowly strand medics come on board, the disc, and then the burr medics. And then from the 80s onwards, we had the aphid problem. So you had aphid introductions, then aphid bred lines. And from then on, you had bred lines, so your softer burr medics, your SU tolerant medics, your powdery mildew resistant medics, and this year we've brought out a spineless barrel medic. So medics have had a long history of improvement. There's quite a lot of breeding in them. There's a long history of farmers knowing how to use them and registered herbicides. Now, if we look at the alternatives, which is the bottom row, you can see the yellow Cerodella there. It's in pink because it was never widely grown. And then the French Cerodella came along in the 1980s. It was soft, so it's not suitable for lay pastures, but it's basically from the late 90s onwards that you've had a range of these alternatives come along. So the Bicerulas, the gland clover, the Margarita French hard, Cerodella, the bladder clovers. So typically they've got one cultivar that's been widely adopted, and there's less options in regards to herbicides and other agronomic issues of them. So just when you're thinking about these alternatives, you need to think about where they came from and what was the drivers when they were being developed. So a number of these alternatives, the Cerodellas and the Bicerulas and the bladder clovers, come from WA, where they're dominated by acidic soils. Whereas you can see on this map in South Australia and Victoria, we are dominated by alkaline soils. So this is a typical scene in South Australia's Mallee area. You've got a dune swale system where on top of the hill with the deep sands, disc medics would perform the best. In the mid slopes, the strand medics would perform the best. And towards the bottom is where you would consider your barrels and your burr medics as being the best option. So a new cultivar that's just was released last year for the first time was Seraph Strand Medic. It has got 15% improved dry matter over the older cultivars, the Strand Medics. It's also got two big insurance policies built into it, namely powdery mildew resistance and also tolerance to SU herbicides. So each and every year across many sites, you get 15% increase in dry matter. If you have a bad powdery mildew year, or if you've got some residue issues, you get vastly increased performance compared to the old cultivars. So it's also got BGA resistance in it. So just a bit more detail about SU herbicide resistance and problems. So SU residues can persist in our highly alkaline soils for 1 to 5 years. After a single application of SU herbicides, dry matter reductions of 75% have been recorded 2 years after that application. And so just to give a list of current cultivars that have tolerance to SU herbicide residues and also Intervix residues, they are Sultan SU, Seraph, Jester SU, and Penfield. So here's a list of traits that are important for legume success. So the ones in the green is the detailed list. If you're a detailed type of person, you wade yourself through here. So seed and seedling vigor is important. So Cerodellas, for instance, if you buy scarified seed of that, it will probably double your normal price that you pay. There's seasonal herbage production and nitrogen fixation, of course, is important. The time of flowering, so you've got to match your flowering time to your seasonal rainfall. Seed production, of course, is important because these are annuals, so they need to set a good seed bank. They've got to be suitable to livestock. So need to just be aware, if you're interested in Bicerula, it does have a phytosensitization, so that's an issue you need to be aware of. Number 6 is suitable to common soil constraints. So the medics, for instance, we're building boron tolerance into them. They need to have suitable hard seed levels, and perhaps tolerance to pests and diseases might be important to you. If you're a less detailed type person, you still probably need to ask these questions in the blue. So what environment were they bred for? What is your environment? How does it differ to where they were bred for? What is your rainfall? How much and when? And in particular, what is your soil type? Your pH and your textures drive a lot of whether these species are suitable or whether they're not. So an example here of choosing the wrong species for your soil type is, here's a French Serradella at Minipa. It's just not suited to this soil with this high pH. So once again, you need to ask yourself about rainfall, your soil type, and your cropping systems. So species have many traits, some that you may be interested in. For instance, you might want to have these ones that you can harvest pods and some are so. But if it is not suitable to your soil type, it will not be successful. So we suggest, if you're interested in these new species, that you sow some test strips up and down a slope to see whether they have a fit on your farm or not. So I showed you that picture there where Serradella underperformed, but here on this figure you can see the site on the right. It's well and truly worth getting out of bed to sow Serradella on this soil type. Whereas those 2 other locations on this site, once again, you're better off sowing your annual medic. So we touched on hard seedness, and regeneration after crop is important when you're doing these laid pasture systems. So here is a range of species, and you can clearly see that the Seraph medic had the best regeneration of any of these species. And all the way over to the right, you can see Trigonella, which had clearly the poorest performer. And it was an experimental species, which at this point in time is not going ahead to the commercial phase. So just trying to bring some of this information all together using a stoplight type system and a range of species down there in column 1. So we're focused on the alkaline soils because we think that's what's more dominant to the audience today. You can see the medics are well and truly suitable to alkaline soils. The Serradellas and the Bicerulas much less so, whereas the bladders, the rose clover and the arrowleaf, as long as it's not too alkaline, they're worth a go. So we've also touched on hard seedness. We think hard seedness in our environment, the medics are well suited to that. The other ones, they're all yellow, they're not red, so they're still worth a go if you're interested in them. So we've touched on this harvesting your own seed pods. So the Serradellas and the arrowleafs are the easiest to harvest. The bladder, the Bicerula, rose clover, you can harvest them, but you need to get your timing right. You need to do it this week, not next week. So we touched on the tolerant of SU residues. If that's an issue for you, it's only really the barrels and the strand medics that are the options. Aphid resistance has been bred into the barrels and the strands, and the boron tolerance has also been bred into the barrels and the strand medics, and hopefully soon the burr medics. So if you're growing your Serradellas, you need to be well and truly aware of budworm, particularly if you're growing your French Serradella. And if you're a low rainfall site, a number of these alternatives, they all flower about 3 weeks later than the early barrel medics. The early medics. So you just need to take that into consideration as well. So a summary of some current legume options. The medics perform best on the neutral to alkaline soils. The alternative legume species, many of them have been developed in the WA, particularly on the acidic soils. They can be aerially harvested. They can perform well. So we're suggesting you target acidic to neutral soils, and we're suggesting to test small areas up and down a slope to experience a range of soil textures and pHs to work out if they've got a fit on your farm. So some new medic cultivars. So these 2 new cultivars have been available in limited supply this season. So you've got Emperor Barrel Medic, which was bred to be powdery mildew resistant. And on the right, you've got Penfield Barrel Medic, which is a spineless barrel medic, but it's also got boron tolerance and SU herbicide tolerant. So this is particularly if you're chasing the best possible wool prices. So some potential future releases that'll come out of the DLIPS project. We've got some spineless burr medics, particularly some boron tolerant lines that are looking very promising. We've got some disc medics for the sandy soils with improved nitrogen fixation ability. And the photo there that you're seeing at the bottom is some arrowleaf clover. We've got an early flowering line with a 30% increased production at this point in time. So when you're thinking about your pastures, your pasture legumes and your sowing lay pastures, this is some of the important things to consider. So the first year of your pastures needs to, your number one aim needs to be to achieve a high seed set so that you've set the long-term persistence. So planting pastures can be expensive, so you need to get it right. So you've got three main levers for when you're doing your sowing. So seeding rate is a thing to consider very carefully before you just go out and plant. The timing of the seeding, so the earlier you can sow, the better they can grow and the more the seed yield will be. But if you need to control some weeds or control a background cultivar, I guess you've got to wait for that. And so seeding depth, so all these species tend to be very small seeded, so they range in size from say 1 milligram up to about 4.5. So you need to keep below 2 centimeters, and absolute maximum is 3 centimeters of depth. So just an example of what the sowing rate means. So this is examples of sowing soft seeds. So if you can see the purple line at the bottom, that's what happens if you sow 1 kilogram of seed. So you don't get a lot of dry matter that year. You potentially also building up a weed problem because there's not much competition in there. So if you go to 5, you're certainly well and truly on the right direction, but we're suggesting consider at least a 10 kilograms sowing rate, particularly if you want to do some light grazing in that first year. And the top line is 50 kilograms per hectare. We're not suggesting you sow that, but that is an example of what a regenerating medic will do, and hence why you always get a lot more production out of a regenerating medic than you do in your first year. So when you're considering the seed cost, you need to think of your seed cost as a component of your total cost of your sowing. So your labor, your machinery, your herbicides, etc. So 5 kilograms of seeds might be only 25% of your total establishment costs. So consider whether or not you're prepared to go up to 10. So summary, medics are the most reliable on the neutral alkaline sandy loams. Other legumes can do well on the right soil, but persistence needs to be considered. Seraph Medic and the Frano Ceradella have been released in 2021, and several further releases are planned. And consider higher seeding rates when you're establishing your pastures. So I'll now hand back to Ross.
Okay, thanks, David. So I'm now just going to run you through some of the rhizobium considerations, which is particularly important with regard to some of these new species that David has talked about. And I guess the first thing is that we need to ensure that the correct rhizobium are used, given the specificity of some of the rhizobium groups. And if you're interested in more information in that space, we have just released a new manual, Inoculating Legumes Practice and Science. That's on the GRDC website. It's an upgrade, a very significant upgrade of the previous Inoculating Legumes manual. And if you just type in that title, it'll come up and you can download a PDF. And that gives some very or good detailed information on the all the pasture and pulse legumes. So just to talk a little bit about the specificity of the pasture legumes, there's a number of different legume groups, and that's because one species of pasture legume is specific in its rhizobium requirement. So, for example, if you take something like, where are we? Can you just get rid of that message, crew? I can't actually see my slide. Sorry about it. That's better. Thank you. So I was just going to point to Bicerula as an example of a specific symbiosis. So that's very specific. It's nodulated by Mesorhizobium sicerae, and you can see both the genera and species of Rhizobium is different to all the others. And so Bicerula won't nodulate at all with any of the other groups of Rhizobium. So just a couple of points of confusion that we do see is often amongst the vetch and the medic Rhizobium. Growers sometimes think that they are nodulated by the same group, but they are not. There are two groups for the medics. The AL should be used on the strand and dis, and the AM on all other medics. And vet should be inoculated with the E or F pulse Rhizobium. It nodulates with those. Ceradella and lupin, now here's where it gets a little complicated. These are very different species, but they just happen to be nodulated by the same Rhizobium species, Bradyrhizobium lupini. So Ceradella can be inoculated with the group S or G inoculant. So just have a look at this chart. When you're inoculating your legumes, make sure you've got the right inoculant for the right legume. And as I say, if there's any confusion, go to that GRDC inoculation manual where it's all very clearly set out. So just a couple of slides on likelihood of inoculation response. So with the medics, it's common that in soils with a recent medic history and where pH is high, that there will already be populations of suitable Rhizobium in those soils. And so you have some buffering capacity in those systems. However, the caveat here is that in the SA Vic Mallee in particular, we do see situations where we still get inoculation responses to medic, and that's particularly on the lighter sands where pH has declined. Some of those mallee soils, the mallee lighter textured soils, the pH is now coming down around 6 after many years of agriculture, and so they are responsive to inoculation. The other issue with the medics is that a lot of the populations that are developed in the soils are less effective than the inoculant Rhizobium. And so you may get a boost by inoculating in the first year, but those populations in the longer term are very difficult to displace. And so David did mention that we are developing what we're calling a promiscuous dismedic, which will form effective symbioses with most of the Rhizobium that it encounters in soils. The other thing in the medic space is that we often get reports that the strand medics have fewer nodules. That is often not something to be too concerned about. Those nodules are very efficient in their ability to fix nitrogen, and that lower numbers of nodulation in the strand medics, so we're talking about things like Seraph, Angel, Herald and Jaguar, they just by their nature have a lower number of nodules on the root systems. In the clover space, the clovers are a little bit similar to the medics in that many soils now have high populations. So again, some buffering capacity in the system there. But what we would point out, if you are going to establish bladder or gland clovers, they are a little bit what we call blinkered in their ability to see the soil populations. So they're just two examples of species where you still need to make sure you get the inoculation right. So there's these large populations of soil Rhizobium, but those two particular species are a little bit distant from many other clovers, and so they don't see the full populations, they only see part of them. So make sure you inoculate those two. And finally, I'll just chat about Bicerula and Ceradella. So Ceradella as I said previously, same group as lupin. So if you've had lupin in the paddock, you should have a reasonable population of suitable rhizobium. And so that's one strategy you can have. If you're establishing Serradella paddocks, maybe target paddocks that have previously had lupin. Otherwise, make sure you inoculate, because the symbiosis is quite specific in its nature. These rhizobium are very tolerant of acidic soils, so soil pH is less of an issue for them. But the flip side to that coin is that the symbiosis is intolerant of free lime, and you can just see here that this is some Serradella growing on Western Eyre Peninsula, and it's not happy at all because it hasn't nodulated well. As I say, if you want to guarantee good nodulation, Serradella as a plant and the symbiosis will perform well where lupins have been previously grown. And finally, the Bicerula. This was only released in the early 2000s as a genera, totally new to Australian agriculture, and the rhizobium is very specific. So that's mandatory that you absolutely always inoculate Serradella in SA and Victoria, and we'd also recommend that you use higher inoculation rates. So the recommendation is a 250 gram packet per 10 kilos of seed. So use that higher inoculation rate in the first year. Okay, I'm just now going to very briefly move on to some of the system benefits, and I've just got 2 slides in this space. And really, this was part of the DLIPS program, trying to quantify the benefits of pastures to encourage their adoption in cropping systems. And across 4 large system trials, after a 1-year pasture break, the mean yield benefit was nearly 0.7 tonne per hectare, on top of an average yield of about 2.3 tonne. So it's a very significant yield increase due to both the nitrogen disease break effects coming off the back of pasture, and similar as you would find in many pulses. The other benefit was that we increased grain protein across the 4 systems trials by an average 0.7%. And often it was moved up from at specific sites from 10% to 12.5% following 1-year pasture legume break. Now the little graphic at the bottom is just from work of Bonnie Floor and Rick Llewellyn at CSIRO, and it just shows the wheat yield response after 1 and 2 year pasture breaks. So on the right hand side, the red bar you can see is a cereal following cereal, and its yield was a little over 3 tonne per hectare. After the 1-year medic break, we were getting 5 tonne at Lameroo, and after 2 years of medic, we were getting up to 6 tonne. So it's increased at that specific site in that year. Cereal after a 2-year pasture break, the wheat yield was up by nearly 3 tonne. So as I say, the average is about 0.65, but in some sites it was much greater than that. And there's just a range of other pasture species on this graph. You can see the Serradella, the Trigonella, and Vetch control. And you can see that so long as you're growing a reasonably adapted species, you will get that legume break benefit. But the caveat there is that the legume actually has to be reasonably well adapted to the environment, and in this trial all those legumes were. And just to finish off, the driver of these benefits in a lot of the trials is nitrogen, soil nitrogen. So this just provides an example from Minipa Research Centre from one of the systems trials, and I'll just run through this for a minute or two. So this is just the available N, nitrate and ammonia, 10 to 60 converted to kilograms per hectare. It's measured at 5 times from 2018 to 2022. and it's under various various rotations. So the red line is continuous cereal, and these other lines are the various pasture legumes. So for example, you can see here the blue line is the old Harbinger Medic, and you see it through time, plods along. So it was 3 years of Harbinger and one wheat crop in the third year. So Harbinger, wheat, Harbinger. Seraph, which is the new powdery mildew medic that David talked about. So it was Seraph crop, Seraph, and that is the green line. And then we had a continuous vetch, which is the black line. So just to simply take home the message, the different legumes, again, there are subtle differences between them, but the main thing is that there's a legume somewhere in the system. And when you get to the end of the 5 years, at the end of these rotations, you can see that the N level under the continuous wheat cereal, is down around 62 kilograms per hectare in the top 60, whereas under the legumes at the top end of those, we're up around 160 kilos per hectare. So a big difference in the N levels at the end of the experiment. And that's going to be important to longer term soil fertility and sustainability, obviously. And that wraps it up. And we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ross and David. That's an incredibly informative and really practical presentation. Very much appreciated. Just typed in a reminder for anyone to get their questions in now. Mindful that we are up to time, so we will have time for one quick question if you do want to type it in quickly. In the meantime, if people are wanting to find out more about the Dryland Legume Pasture Systems Project's findings, where can they go, Ross?
Well, there is recently just a GRDC ground cover supplement come out. So that provides a bit of a high level overview of what was done in the project and some of the broader outcomes, but it also provides the contact details of people who growers and agronomists can contact if they wish to follow up on any of that information.
Perfect, thanks Ross. Now we haven't had any questions come in and I am keen to stick to time. So thank you very much for your time, Ross and David, and thank you to our audience for joining in. This is the final webinar in our series. I've just popped up a link to the WIMRA CMA's YouTube channel where you can find recordings of other webinars in both this and other CMA series. Once the webinar finishes, you'll be directed to a survey link. It would be very much appreciated if you could please fill it out for us. It takes an average of 37 seconds to complete, and your input is really important for us in planning and evaluating this and other activities. Thanks again for participating in today's pasture webinar, supported by the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. I hope that you all have a lovely day.